Welcome to our channel. Enjoy our story and don't forget to subscribe.
The first thing I noticed wasn't the size of the house. It was the flowers. Not a bouquet someone had picked up on the way home from the grocery store. Not even a tasteful arrangement from a decent florist downtown. These were fresh peonies, white, full stems, cut at exactly the right length, sitting in a crystal vase on a marble console table right there in the entryway, like they'd been placed there that morning by someone who knew precisely what impression a single detail could make. And next to them, half hidden behind a cream leather portfolio, but not hidden enough, was an opened envelope. Gold letterhead, heavy stock, a name printed across the top that I recognized immediately. Not because I'd ever been a client, but because I work in finance, and that letterhead belonged to one of the 3 private wealth management firms in this city that never, ever advertised. The kind of firm you only knew existed if someone had already decided you were worth knowing about. Stood there for maybe 2 seconds. David was already unzipping his jacket behind me, saying something about the traffic on Route 9, asking if I wanted him to take my coat. I smiled and handed it to him. A thin cardigan, cream, slightly worn at the cuffs. I'd chosen it that morning like armor, not to protect myself, but to give other people exactly what they were already expecting to see. I looked like someone who tried, someone who cared but didn't have much to work with, someone who shopped at places with sale racks near the front door. But standing in that entryway, I already knew something David either didn't know or had been hoping I wouldn't figure out, and I hadn't even taken my shoes off yet. Let me back up. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old. I work in corporate compliance at a mid-sized financial services firm on the 11th floor of a building downtown that most people walk past without looking up. My job is not glamorous. I don't close deals. I don't ring bells or shake hands at fundraisers. I read contracts. I flag risk. I find the sentences that sound reasonable on the surface but contain one word, one single word, that could cost a company millions if nobody catches it. And I catch it. Every time. I've been doing this for 6 years, and the salary I earn reflects the fact that I am very, very good at it. I make $10,000 a month. After taxes. That's not a number I throw around. I don't talk about money at parties. I don't post anything online that would hint at how I live or what I have. I learned a long time ago that the moment people know what you're worth, they stop seeing you. They see the number instead. David didn't know. Not because I lied to him. I want to be clear about that. I never said a single false thing about my income or my finances. Not once. He assumed. It happened naturally, the way these things do when 2 people are still learning each other. About 3 months into our relationship, he mentioned that money was tight. His family expected certain things from him, he said. Appearances, contributions, showing up in the right places, and his salary from the non-profit where he worked barely covered it. He said it casually, like he was just sharing something true about his life. And I listened. And I nodded, and I let the silence fill itself with the impression that we were in roughly the same financial neighborhood. I didn't correct him, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Not then. Why? Because of something my grandmother told me when I was 19 years old, holding my first real paycheck in both hands like it was made of glass. I just started as a junior analyst at a small firm. It was the most money I'd ever seen with my name on it, and I was terrified of it in a way I couldn't quite explain. She sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped me with homework for 12 years, and she said something I've carried with me every day since. "Before you let someone see your hand," she said, "make sure you know what game they're playing." She wasn't talking about cards. She wasn't talking about being secretive or suspicious. She was talking about people, about how fast someone decides what you're worth the second they think they know what you have, about how a woman with money gets treated differently than a woman without it. Not better, necessarily. just differently, and not always in ways you want. So I kept my hand close, and when David assumed, I let him. 2 weeks before the dinner, David called me on a Tuesday evening. He was nervous in that way he got nervous. Not loud, not pacing, quiet. Careful with his words, like he was arranging them in a specific order before he let them out. "My mom wants to have you over for dinner," he said. "This Saturday, just the family." "Just the family," I repeated. "My dad's traveling. So it'll be my mom, my sister, and there might be one other person, a family friend, older woman. She's been around forever." I said yes. I said it easily, like it was a simple thing. And then I spent the next 5 days watching David more carefully than I ever had before. He didn't say anything about what to wear. He didn't give me a list of rules or warnings the way some people do before a first dinner with their parents. He just kept checking on me, texting during the day, calling in the evening, with a warmth that felt genuine. He was a good man. I believed that then, and in some ways, I believe it still. But good and honest are not the same thing, and I was starting to understand the difference. Margaret opened the door herself. That was the first move of the evening, and it was a smart one. Not having a housekeeper answer, not having David let us in, her doing it personally. It made the whole thing feel intimate, casual. Like this was just a family getting together on a Saturday night. Nothing formal, nothing at stake. The performance of no performance at all. She was beautiful in the way that women with money and discipline are beautiful after 50. Not frozen, not overdone, but maintained. Every strand of hair in place without looking like it had been placed there. Her clothes were expensive in the way that only someone who spent real money on clothes would recognize. The fabric, the cut, the way it moved when she moved. She wasn't trying to impress anyone in that room. She'd stopped needing to impress people a long time ago. But she knew, she absolutely knew, that other people were always trying to read her, and she controlled exactly what they saw. Her smile when she looked at me was warm, genuinely warm, or at least warm enough that I couldn't have proven otherwise. She took both my hands in hers. The grip was firm, dry. The grip of a woman who had shaken 10,000 hands in her life and knew precisely how much pressure to apply. "Claire, we've heard so much about you." Beat. "Come in." David's hand found the small of my back as we stepped inside. I felt his fingers press, gently but noticeably, a signal. I wasn't sure what it was meant to say. Be yourself. Be quiet. Be smaller. I didn't ask. The living room opened up to the left. Large, but not the kind of large that announces itself. The kind of large that simply is. The furniture was old in the way that good furniture gets old, worn in specific places, polished in others, kept because it was worth keeping, not because no one had gotten around to replacing it. Above the fireplace hung a painting I looked at for a full 3 seconds before I understood what I was seeing. Not a print, not a reproduction, an original. The kind of art that sat in rooms like this, not because someone had decorated around it, but because someone had bought it decades ago, when it cost a fraction of what it was worth now, and had simply never moved it. That was the thing about this family's money. It didn't shout. It didn't need to. It sat in the room the way oxygen sits in a room, invisible, essential, and completely taken for granted by anyone who'd grown up breathing it. I sat where Margaret gestured. A cream sofa, deep cushions, the kind of thing you sink into whether you want to or not, and accepted a glass of wine. Burgundy. Old from the smell of it. I didn't plan to drink more than a sip. I needed to be clear-headed. I needed to be listening. David sat next to me, close but not touching, his own performance of ease. Margaret settled into the chair across from us with the kind of comfort that only comes from decades of sitting in that exact spot, in that exact room. She crossed her ankles. She held her wine glass at chest height, not drinking, just holding, watching. "So, Claire," she said, "David tells us you work in an office downtown." The way she said it, an office, told me everything I needed to know about what she'd already decided. Not the words, the emphasis, the slight flattening of the phrase, as if she were describing somewhere unremarkable, a dentist's waiting room, a DMV. "I do," I said. "Something in administration?" I looked at her directly, not challenging her, just looking. She already knew it wasn't administration. The question wasn't a question. It was a box she was trying to put me in before I had the chance to step into one of my own. "Compliance," I said. "Corporate risk assessment." A half-second pause. Her smile didn't change, not even slightly. But something behind it shifted. Not surprise. Something colder than surprise. Recalculation. "How interesting," she said, and took a sip of her wine. David's sister, Nora, arrived 20 minutes later, blowing through the front door with the kind of energy that fills a room whether the room wants it or not. She was younger than David by 2 years, louder by a factor of 10, and dressed in a way that suggested she'd gotten ready in 15 minutes, and considered that more than enough. Her clothes were expensive, I could see that, but she wore them like she'd grabbed them off a rack without looking. Careless. The specific carelessness of someone who had always had enough that it never occurred to her to be careful with any of it. "Mom, sorry. The parking." She stopped when she saw me, not a full stop, a stumble, a flicker of something, surprise maybe, or assessment, that she covered almost fast enough for me to miss. Almost. "You must be Claire," she said, smiling in a way that was friendly on the surface and measuring underneath. She hugged me, which I wasn't expecting. It was brief and slightly too tight, the way people hug when they're trying to seem relaxed and aren't quite pulling it off. "It's good to meet you," I said, and I meant it. Nora was going to be easy to read, much easier than her mother. The fourth person at dinner was already there when we sat down, a woman named Ruth. She'd been introduced as a family friend, which is what people say when they don't want to explain the actual relationship. Ruth was in her mid-60s, maybe older, silver hair, cut short, practical. She wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry except a single gold bracelet that looked old and well-made. She didn't take up space the way Margaret did. Deliberately, strategically, Ruth was simply present. Quietly, completely present. When Margaret introduced us, Ruth looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful attention. Not curiosity exactly, something steadier than that. She shook my hand once, said, "Nice to meet you, Claire." And that was it. No questions, no small talk. She just looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then looked away. Dinner was at 7:30. Margaret had not cooked it herself. There were traces of someone else's hands in the kitchen, professional touches, the kind of meal that gets assembled by someone who does this for a living. Roasted chicken, vegetables with herbs I couldn't quite identify, a salad that was simple but clearly cost more than it looked like it should. Everything was served family style, which was another choice. Intimate, casual, here, pass the bowl. We're all just people here at this table. We weren't all just people here, but I appreciated the performance. Halfway through the meal, Nora leaned across the table and said, "So how did you two actually meet? David never tells us anything." David shifted in his seat. Margaret's eyes moved to him, just briefly, just a flicker, and back to me. "A friend introduced us," David said. "Which friend?" Nora pressed. She wasn't being rude, she was just being Nora, the kind of person who asked follow-up questions before the first answer had fully landed, not because she was suspicious, but because she genuinely didn't think about the effect of it. "Someone from work," David said, and then quieter. "It's not a complicated story, Nora." Margaret said nothing. She cut a piece of chicken with the kind of precision that suggested she was paying close attention to everything happening at that table, while appearing to pay attention to nothing at all. I watched Ruth during all of this. She ate slowly. She listened. When Nora's questions turned to me, where did I grow up? Did I have family nearby? What did I do for fun? Ruth didn't look away from me once. Not rudely, not intrusively. She just watched the way someone watches when they already know the shape of the story and are waiting to see how it unfolds. At one point, between the main course and dessert, Margaret refilled everyone's wine and then turned to me with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, not too bright, not too subdued, and said, "Claire, I have to say, it's so nice to finally meet someone who seems genuinely content with a quieter life. Not everyone needs the big salary and the big apartment. There's something lovely about simplicity." It was perfectly done. The compliment that wasn't a compliment. The way of saying you are small and that's okay without ever using the word small. I took a sip of my wine, set the glass down, looked at her. "Thank you," I said, though I'd push back on one thing. Simplicity and contentment aren't really the same thing, are they? You can have one without the other. The table went quiet. Not dramatically quiet. Just still. Nora blinked. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret held my gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, and then smiled. Not the warm version she'd been wearing all evening, but something sharper, something that acknowledged what had just happened without conceding anything, and said, "I suppose you're right about that." Ruth, across the table, picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the corner of her mouth move, not quite a smile. Something quieter than that, something like recognition. Dessert was a chocolate thing, mousse or something close to it, served in small glass cups, the kind of dish that's meant to signal refinement without trying too hard. Margaret brought it out herself, which was another move. The careful choreography of a woman who understood that every action in front of guests was a sentence in a longer story she was telling about herself. I ate slowly. I watched. And I listened to the way this family talked to each other. Not what they said, but how. Margaret and Nora spoke in shorthand, the way people do when they've been having the same conversations for years. David filled in the gaps, offering commentary that was agreeable and safe, and never once contradicted either of them. He was good at that. Seamless. The kind of person who could be in a room full of people and somehow manage to offend no one, because he never quite committed to a single opinion long enough for anyone to push back on it. I'd admired that about him once. Now I was starting to understand what it actually was. Ruth ate quietly. She asked Margaret one question about a mutual acquaintance, someone in real estate, it sounded like, and listened to the answer with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was filing it away for later. When their eyes met across the table, something passed between them that I couldn't quite read. Not hostility, not warmth, something older than both. After dessert, Margaret suggested we move to the sitting room for coffee. It was phrased as a suggestion. It was not a suggestion. The sitting room was off the main hallway past the kitchen. Margaret led the way, Ruth beside her, the two of them falling into a quiet conversation I couldn't hear. David and Nora trailed behind, Nora talking about something on her phone, a text from someone, a plan for next weekend. I wasn't tracking it. I walked behind all of them, and I took my time. I needed to use the bathroom. Margaret had pointed it out earlier. Down the hall, second door on the left. I thanked her and peeled off from the group. The hallway was quiet, carpeted. The kind of thick, expensive carpet that swallows sound completely, which meant that when I passed the first door on the left, a study, door slightly ajar, I heard everything inside it without trying. Margaret's voice. Not the warm, polished version she'd been wearing all evening. This was different, tighter, faster. The voice of someone who was managing a problem, not hosting a dinner party. "The deadline is the 15th, she said. "If the paperwork isn't filed by then, the whole restructuring falls apart. Do you understand what that means?" I stopped walking. Not dramatically. I just stopped. The way you stop when your body registers something before your brain catches up. There was a pause. Then David's voice, and the sound of it hit me somewhere below my ribs because he wasn't in the sitting room. He was in that study. He'd slipped away while I was walking down the hall, and he was standing in that room with his mother, and he was talking about a deadline. "I know," he said. "I know the timeline." "Then why hasn't it been done? I asked you 3 weeks ago." There's been a lot going on. Claire and I. Claire. Margaret said it the way you say the name of something that's gotten in the way of something more important. Not cruel, dismissive. The way you'd say the weather when it was interfering with a plan. "The trust documentation needs your signature, David. Not next month. Not after you've figured out your personal life. The 15th. That's 11 days. Another pause. I could hear him shifting his weight. I know that sound. I'd been next to him on enough couches in enough cars to recognize the way he moved when he was uncomfortable. When he was trying to figure out what to say that would make someone else feel better without actually changing anything. "What about the Meridian account?" he asked. "You said, 'I handled Meridian.' That's not your concern. Your concern is the signature and making sure Claire doesn't start asking questions about the timeline." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. Everything about me was steady because I had spent years learning how to stay calm when information landed that you weren't supposed to have. It's the first thing compliance training teaches you. The moment you react, you lose the advantage. Stay still. Process. Move later. What I just heard was not a family having a private conversation about finances. It was a mother directing her son to execute a legal document, a trust restructuring, from the sound of it, under a hard deadline, and to do it quietly. And the person she was most concerned about keeping in the dark was me. Not because I was a threat, because I was useful. I finished walking to the bathroom. I closed the door. I ran the water, and I looked at myself in the mirror. Plain blouse, no jewelry, shoes that cost $47. And I thought, there it is. He wasn't weak. Or rather, he was weak, but weakness wasn't the whole picture. He was complicit. He had been complicit for a while. And the way he'd introduced me to this family, the way he'd let me believe we were in the same place financially, the way he'd brought me here, looking exactly like someone who wouldn't know what to do with information like this, none of it was an accident. I dried my hands. I turned off the water. I went back to the sitting room and sat down next to David on the sofa and accepted a cup of coffee and smiled at Margaret when she handed it to me, and I did not let a single thing show on my face. I did not confront him that night. Not in the car. Not when we got home. Not when he kissed me goodnight and fell asleep in 20 minutes the way he always did, like a man with a clear conscience, which told me everything I needed to know about the size of the gap between what he thought a conscience was supposed to feel like and what it actually felt like. I lay next to him in the dark for a long time, not angry. That would come later, maybe. Right now, I was thinking. I had 2 choices. I could walk away. I could take what I knew and disappear from the situation entirely. Quit the relationship, move on, protect myself from whatever was coming. It was the safe choice, the smart choice by most people's standards. Or I could stay. I could let this play out. I could say yes to whatever came next. The trust signing, the family events, the next dinner, the next performance. And I could watch. And I could learn everything there was to learn about what this family was doing and why and who else was involved. Not because I wanted to destroy them, because I wanted to understand them completely. And once I understood them completely, I could decide what to do with that understanding. My grandmother's voice again, quiet and steady in my memory. Before you let someone see your hand, make sure you know what game they're playing. I knew the game now. I just didn't know all the rules yet. I decided to stay. The next 3 weeks were the most controlled I had ever been in my life. I went to the family events Margaret organized, a brunch the following Sunday, a cocktail hour the weekend after that, a casual get-together at Nora's apartment that was supposed to be casual and was actually another opportunity for Margaret to observe me in different lighting. I wore the same kind of clothes, plain, modest, the cardigan, the dark slacks, the same cheap shoes. I smiled. I listened. I asked the right questions at the right moments. Not too many, not too few. Enough to seem engaged. Not enough to seem like I was paying attention to the wrong things. I was paying attention to the wrong things. At work, I used the tools I'd spent 6 years sharpening. Public records, property filings, corporate registrations, court documents where they existed. None of it required special access. None of it required anything I wasn't already authorized to do as part of my job. I wasn't running searches on their behalf. I was running them on my own time, using databases I already knew how to navigate. The same way I'd track risk for a client, I tracked it for them, quietly, methodically, one thread at a time. What I found, piece by piece over those 3 weeks, was this. Margaret's family had money, real money, generational money, the kind that sits in trusts and compounds quietly, while the people it belongs to live their lives without thinking about it. But the trusts were structured in a way that was unusual, layered, complex, with a series of conditions and deadlines built into them that I'd only seen once or twice before in my career, the kind of structure that someone had built specifically to move wealth in a particular direction while making it look like it was staying exactly where it had always been. David was the one with signing authority on the most recent restructuring, not Margaret, him. And the deadline Margaret had mentioned, the 15th, was real. I found the filing reference on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my desk with a cup of cold coffee, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of a picture finally coming into focus after weeks of staring at blurred edges. There was one moment, in the middle of all of this, when I almost got caught. David and I were at dinner. Just the two of us, a restaurant we both liked. Nothing fancy. And he asked me if I'd noticed anything different about his mood lately. It was a strange question. Too specific to be casual. Too pointed to be idle. Different how? I said. I don't know. Stressed, maybe. Distracted. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between guilt and hope. Like he wanted me to say yes, I noticed. Tell me what's wrong so he could unburden himself without actually having to volunteer anything. I held his gaze. For 1 second, just one, I felt the weight of everything I knew sitting right behind my teeth. The trust, the deadline, the way his mother had said my name in that study like I was a variable she was trying to eliminate from an equation. You seem fine to me, I said. Maybe a little tired. He nodded. Relaxed, reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I let him, and I smiled, and something inside me went very quiet in a way that hurt more than I expected it to. Ruth called me. I don't know how she got my number. I didn't ask. She called on a Wednesday evening, introduced herself as if we hadn't already met, and suggested we get coffee sometime that week. Her tone was matter of fact. No small talk around the edges of the invitation. Just, would. You like to meet? Thursday at 2. A place near my office. Yes or no? I said yes. We sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for the first 5 minutes we talked about nothing. The weather, the neighborhood, the quality of the coffee. Ruth was patient with it. Patient in the way of someone who knew the conversation would get where it needed to go eventually and saw no reason to rush it. Then she looked at me and said, "How much do you know about Margaret's family?" I could have deflected. I could have played ignorant. The same way I'd been playing it for weeks, the same way David wanted me to play it. But something about Ruth, the steadiness of her, the way she'd watched me at that dinner table, told me that deflection would be a waste of both our time. "Enough," I said. She nodded, like that was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "I knew Margaret for 30 years, she said. Business, real estate mostly. I trusted her once, trusted her with something that mattered." She paused, took a sip of her coffee. "That was a mistake." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I could see it in the way she held herself, not broken by it, not bitter exactly, but carrying it. The way people carry things that happened to them a long time ago and never fully resolved. She'd lost something because of Margaret, something real, and she'd never gotten it back. "People remember," Ruth said, after a silence that didn't feel uncomfortable. "In business, people remember who treated them well and who didn't. Sometimes for a very long time. Longer than most people think." I looked at her across the table. This woman I barely knew, who had every reason to want Margaret to suffer, and was sitting here with perfect composure, not a trace of venom anywhere in her voice. And I understood something important. Ruth wasn't here because she wanted revenge. She was here because she believed in something about honesty, about the idea that people shouldn't be able to hide behind money forever, no matter how carefully the money was structured, no matter how many layers of paperwork stood between them and the truth. She was here because she'd seen what I was seeing, and she wanted to know if I was going to do anything about it. "I'm working on it," I said. Ruth smiled, a real smile, small and quiet, and picked up her coffee again. "Good," she said. "Take your time. But not too much of it. These things have a way of collapsing on their own once someone starts pulling the right threads. The trick is knowing which threads to pull." I finished my coffee. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. She told me about a property she'd owned in the 70s, a building near the waterfront that she'd renovated herself, brick by brick, because she couldn't afford to hire anyone to do it. The pride in her voice when she talked about it was the purest thing I'd heard in weeks. When we said goodbye, she squeezed my arm once, firm, brief, and walked away without looking back. I walked back to my office slowly, taking the long way through the quiet streets, and I thought about what kind of life I actually wanted. Not the relationship, not David, not the family or the dinners or any of it. My life, the one I was building on my own, quietly. One paycheck at a time, one correct decision at a time. The apartment I'd furnished myself, the savings account that was mine and mine alone, the work I was good at, the work that mattered, the work that no one had given me and no one could take away. I knew what I wanted. I'd known for a long time. I just needed a little more time to make sure everyone else knew it too. The invitation came from Margaret, as everything did, a charity gala. Her word, though, gala was doing a lot of work for what was essentially a fundraising dinner at a venue downtown that I knew well. I'd walked past it 100 times on my way to the office. Glass facade, brass fixtures, the kind of building that made you feel, just by being near it, like money was a thing that existed in the air and you either breathed it or you didn't. Margaret called it a small gathering. 200 people, she said. just friends and colleagues. Nothing formal. Everything about it was formal. The guest list alone told me that. I recognized 3 names on it. Not personally, but professionally. People whose firms I'd read about in compliance filings, people whose names appeared in the kinds of documents I spent my days analyzing. This wasn't a charity event. It was a room full of people who mattered to Margaret, and she wanted them all in the same place, at the same time, where she could see them and they could see her. And she wanted me there, still playing the part. David told me about the dress code on a Thursday. Black tie optional, he said. I nodded. I told him I'd figure something out. He looked relieved, the way he always looked when I didn't make things complicated for him, and kissed my forehead and went back to his phone. That night, I opened my closet and looked at the clothes I actually owned, not the ones I'd been wearing to Margaret's dinners, my real clothes. A black dress I'd bought 2 years ago for a work event. Simple cut, good fabric, the kind of thing that looks like nothing until you're in it and then it looks like exactly the right amount of everything. Silk. Not showy, just accurate. The dress of someone who knew what she was worth and had stopped needing to prove it. I hung it on the door and looked at it for a long time. The night of the event, I got ready alone. David had gone ahead. Something about helping Margaret with last-minute logistics, which I now understood meant something specific and operational, not domestic. I took my time. I did my makeup carefully, but simply. I wore the dress. I wore the one piece of jewelry I owned that mattered, a thin gold chain my grandmother had given me, nothing flashy, just old and well-made and mine. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time before I left, not checking, not adjusting, just looking, making sure I recognized the woman looking back at me. I did. The room was already full when I arrived. Not fashionably late, I'd timed it deliberately. Late enough that the space had settled into itself, that people had found their positions, that the social architecture of the evening had already taken shape. Late enough that when I walked in, there were eyes to notice. I didn't make an entrance. I walked through the door the way anyone walks through a door, one foot, then the other. But I was wearing my own clothes, my own face, my own life on my body, and in a room full of people who had spent the last several weeks watching me pretend to be someone smaller, the effect was immediate. It wasn't shock. It was a shift, a quiet recalibration that moved through the room like a current. A woman near the bar, someone I didn't know, a colleague of Margaret's, I thought, looked at me twice. The second time, she leaned toward the man next to her and said something. I didn't hear what. I didn't need to. Word travels fast in rooms like that. Not because people are careless, because they are paying attention, and they are very good at reading each other, and the story I had been telling with my appearance for weeks had just changed, and everyone in that room understood that a changed story meant something had happened. I got a glass of wine. I found a spot near the edge of the room where I could see the whole space, and I waited. Ruth found me first. She was wearing dark green, a simple dress, well cut, the kind of thing that looked effortless and probably cost a great deal. She appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of something sparkling and handed me one without asking. "You look like yourself," she said. "I do," I said. She smiled. We stood together for a moment, watching the room. Margaret was across the space, near the main table, talking to a group of older men in suits. She hadn't seen me yet, or if she hadn't reacted. I couldn't tell from this distance. "The Whitmore people are here," Ruth said quietly. "Third table from the back. The woman in blue is Susan Whitmore. She handles charitable foundations for 3 of the largest family offices in the state." I looked. Susan Whitmore was exactly where Ruth said she was. A calm, composed woman in a navy dress, speaking quietly to someone next to her. The kind of person who listened more than she talked. The kind of person whose opinion carried weight precisely because she didn't give it often. Why is that useful? I asked, though I already knew. Because Susan has been looking for a reason to ask questions about Margaret's foundation for 2 years, Ruth said. She just didn't have one until tonight. Ruth squeezed my arm, the same gesture from the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, and drifted away into the crowd with the ease of someone who had been navigating rooms like this for decades. I finished my wine. I set the glass down, and I went to talk to Susan Whitmore. I didn't tell Susan everything. That wasn't the point. I told her enough. Specific things, real things, the kind of details that a woman in her position would know how to follow up on. A filing date, a trust structure, a name, Meridian, that I'd found in the public records 3 weeks earlier, attached to a shell company that traced back, after 2 more layers of paperwork, to a registered agent connected to Margaret's family office. Susan listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly. No raised eyebrows, no sharp intake of breath. She just listened, steadily, without surprise, the way a person listens when they already suspected something and are now hearing it confirmed. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Public records," I said. "All of it. I work in compliance." Another pause. Then she nodded, once, firm, and said, "Thank you, Claire." That was all. She turned back to the man she'd been speaking with before I arrived, and I walked away, and the conversation was over. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because Susan Whitmore was the kind of person who, once she had a thread, would pull it. Quietly. Thoroughly. And the people she told would tell other people, and the questions would start being asked in rooms where questions carried consequences. I didn't need to detonate anything. I just needed to hand someone the match and step back. I spoke to 2 more people that evening. A man named Gerald who ran a family office downtown and had, I knew from my research, been a silent investor in one of the entities connected to the Meridian account. I told him what I'd told Susan, not everything, just enough, the right amount of information for the right person. He thanked me with the same quiet nod Susan had given me, and I moved on. The second was a woman named Patricia, who ran a board that oversaw charitable giving in the region. Ruth had pointed her out earlier in the evening. A small nod across the room, nothing more. I approached Patricia near the dessert table, introduced myself, and had a conversation that lasted 4 minutes. I didn't mention Margaret by name. I didn't need to. I asked Patricia a hypothetical question. If a foundation were structured in a particular way, with particular conditions on its disbursements, would that raise any flags for her board? And watched her expression as the hypothetical landed. It did. I left Patricia alone with it. David found me at 9:45. He was standing near the bar, and he'd been watching me for a while. I could tell by the way he held his glass, too tight, the way he always held things when he was trying to stay calm and not quite managing it. When I walked past him toward the restroom, he stepped into my path. "Claire." His voice was low, not angry, scared. "David, what are you doing?" He wasn't accusing me. He was asking, genuinely, desperately. The kind of question a person asks when the ground is shifting under them and they don't know how to stop it. I looked at him. I looked at his face. The face I'd woken up next to for 8 months. The face I'd kissed good morning and good night. The face of a man I had genuinely liked, maybe more than liked, before I understood what he was willing to do to keep his mother from being disappointed. "I'm being honest," I said, "for the first time since we met." "Claire, please." I gave him one chance, one question, the only question that mattered. "Did you know?" I asked. "About the trust, about Meridian, about what your mother is doing with that money. Did you know before tonight?" He didn't answer. Not right away. He looked at me, and I watched his face go through 3 or 4 things in the space of 2 seconds. Guilt, calculation, something that might have been love, and then something that looked a lot like the decision to stay silent because silence was safer than the truth. He didn't answer. That was the answer. "Okay," I said, and I meant it. Not as forgiveness, as closure. As the end of something that had already ended weeks ago in a hallway on a carpeted floor, listening to his mother say my name like it was an inconvenience. I walked away from him. He didn't follow. Margaret tried. I saw it happen from across the room. Not a confrontation, not a scene. Margaret moved through the crowd toward Susan Whitmore with the kind of controlled urgency that looked, to anyone not paying attention, like a hostess checking on a guest. But Susan had already spoken to 2 other people by then. The information was moving, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way water moves through a crack. You don't hear it. You just notice later that the crack is wider than it was before. Margaret reached Susan. They exchanged words I couldn't hear. Susan's expression didn't change. Polite, attentive, giving nothing away. Margaret smiled. Susan smiled back. And then Margaret turned and walked toward the bar, and the smile dropped off her face like something she'd set down. She looked across the room, not at me, past me, at Ruth, who was standing near the window with a glass of champagne, watching everything with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this particular evening to arrive. Their eyes met. Margaret held Ruth's gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. I watched her for a moment longer. She was standing very still. The way a person stands still when they are trying to figure out, in real time, how much damage has been done and whether any of it can be undone. The answer, I knew, was that it couldn't. Not tonight. Not the way she was used to handling things. The room had already moved. The conversations had already happened. The questions were already forming in the minds of the people who would ask them publicly, formally, in the places where questions like that had teeth. Margaret's power had always been informational. She controlled what people knew and when they knew it. Tonight, someone else had controlled that. And there was nothing in her playbook for what to do when the room already had the information and she hadn't been the one to give it. I didn't stay to watch her figure that out. I left at 10:15, no announcement, no goodbye to anyone except Ruth, who I found near the coat check. She handed me my jacket. She'd been holding it, I realized, without my having asked her to. "Thank you," I said. "You did the work," Ruth said. "I just pointed you at the right doors." We stood there for a moment, 2 women in a hallway, and there was nothing left to say that needed saying. Ruth nodded once, slow, firm, and I walked out. The night air was cold. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, just breathing. The city was quiet in the way cities are quiet at night. Not silent, just settled. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt the way you feel when something that was wrong for a long time has finally been corrected. Not happy exactly. Settled. Like a thing that needed to be true was now true, and the world was slightly more honest than it had been that morning. David texted me the next day. A long message. I could see the preview on my phone, the first line beginning with, "Claire, I need you to understand." I didn't open it. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There was nothing in that message that would change anything. He would explain himself. He would probably apologize. He might even mean it. But meaning it and being sorry don't undo what you chose to do. And he had chosen every single day for months to stand on his mother's side of a line that I was on the other side of. That choice had been made. It didn't need to be revisited. I deleted the message without reading it. The news broke on Tuesday. Not front-page news, not the kind of thing that makes headlines in the way people think of headlines. A business journal. A brief article about an investigation into charitable disbursements connected to a family office in the city. Margaret's name appeared in the third paragraph. The tone was neutral, factual, the kind of reporting that doesn't editorialize. It just states what is known and what is being looked into. I read it at my desk, drinking coffee at 8:15 in the morning. The office was quiet. My colleagues were arriving, hanging up coats, checking emails. Normal Tuesday sounds. I finished the article, closed the browser, and pulled up the first compliance file of the day. A contract for a client I'd been reviewing since last week, a clause on page 14 that needed flagging. I flagged it. I wrote up my notes. I sent them to the relevant team. Then I made another cup of coffee, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The buildings, the traffic, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in motion. And I felt, for the first time in months, like I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be standing. At 5 o'clock, I picked up my things, turned off the light, and walked out. The office door closed behind me. Not a slam. A click.